5 years later, January 6th is no longer just a date. It has become a mirror, and what Americans see in it depends entirely on where they stand. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and when a nation cannot agree on the basic facts of a violent attack on its own democracy, something deeper is breaking. On one side, lawmakers replay the footage, reissue the documents, and insist the truth still matters. On the other, pardoned rioters march back to the Capitol, calling themselves patriots, while a sitting president dismisses the entire conversation as media obsession. This is not simply disagreement. It is the emergence of two political realities occupying the same country at the same time. If you want to understand modern America, how power is rewritten, how memory is reshaped, how accountability dissolves, stay with me. Share this if you believe facts still matter. Because before we debate the future, we must first understand what this moment is really about. And to do that, we need to clearly define the problem itself. To understand why January 6th still divides the country so deeply, we have to be precise about what is being contested. This is no longer a debate about crowd size or broken windows. It is a struggle over meaning. One version of reality treats January 6th as an assault on democratic transfer of power, driven by a sitting president who refused to accept electoral defeat and encouraged supporters to challenge the outcome. In this view, accountability is not optional. It is foundational. The other version reframes the same day as a misunderstood protest, exaggerated by political opponents and a hostile press. Violence is minimized, responsibility is blurred, and those who broke the law are recast as victims of a system weaponized against them. These competing narratives are not evolving toward consensus. They are hardening. Reinforced by pardons, political promotions, and selective memory, they now coexist without touching. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. When facts themselves become partisan, democracy loses its common language. And to see how we arrived here, we have to go back before the attack, before the hearings, to the conditions that made this split possible in the first place. To understand how this fracture became possible, we have to step back and look at the deeper forces at work, the slow-moving currents beneath the explosion. January 6th did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the culmination of a long erosion of trust in institutions, elections, courts, media, even the idea of shared truth. For years, political identity became emotional identity. Winning was no longer about policy. It was about survival, belonging, and grievance. When the 2020 election ended, that emotional infrastructure was already in place. Claims of fraud did not need evidence to spread. They needed repetition, authority, and a sense of betrayal. And they found all three. Digital platforms accelerated this cycle. Online communities transformed suspicion into certainty, loyalty into radicalization. What once would have remained fringe moved steadily into the mainstream. By the time Congress convened to certify the vote, the mechanism was set. A belief system had been built, one that could interpret any outcome as proof of injustice. And once belief replaces verification, confrontation becomes inevitable. Which brings us to the first rupture, the moment when rhetoric turned into action, and the consequences became impossible to ignore. Then came the rupture. What unfolded on January 6th was not spontaneous chaos. It was a collision between belief and reality. As Congress met to certify the election, thousands converged on the Capitol, convinced they were correcting a stolen outcome. Windows shattered. Police lines collapsed. Lawmakers fled. And for hours, the seat of American democracy was breached from within. The meaning of that moment still reverberates. For some, it was a shocking revelation how fragile democratic norms truly are when pressure is applied. For others, it became something to be rationalized, reinterpreted, or erased. In the years that followed, the legal system moved with historic force. Nearly 1,600 people were charged. Trials were held, convictions followed, but justice did not reach a clean resolution. It was interrupted, Mass pardons reframed consequences as persecution. Violence was rebranded as injustice. And the signal sent was unmistakable. Loyalty could override law. If you're trying to make sense of why truth now feels optional in politics, this is a moment to pause and pay attention. Because what matters most is not just what happened that day, it's what the system did next. And that takes us to the deeper machinery quietly shaping everything we're seeing now. What followed was not chaos, but something more subtle and far more consequential. Beneath the headlines, a quiet mechanism began to operate. Accountability became negotiable. Institutions that once moved in sequence, investigation, judgment, consequence, were interrupted by power. The rule of law did its work, but only up to a point. Then politics stepped in. Mass clemency did more than free individuals. It rewrote incentives. It told supporters that actions taken in service of a leader would be protected, even retroactively. Prosecutors were sidelined. Evidence was scrubbed. Records were softened or erased. What had been the largest criminal investigation in American history was abruptly halted, not by new facts, but by authority. At the same time, narrative power shifted. The attack was no longer framed as an assault on democracy, but as a grave national injustice against those who carried it out. The system was recast as the villain. This is how democracies weaken, not through coups alone, but through normalization. When law bends, memory fades, and consequences disappear, the boundary between right and wrong becomes political preference. And once that line dissolves, the next crisis doesn't need to be planned. It simply arrives. Then came the second surge, quieter but more dangerous. This time, the crisis did not unfold on the steps of the Capitol. It unfolded inside institutions. Prosecutors who had spent years on the most sweeping investigation in American history were reassigned or pushed out. Ongoing cases were dropped. Evidence vanished from public view. What had once been treated as an extraordinary breach of law was slowly absorbed into the background noise of politics. Some of those who were pardoned did not disappear. A number were later accused of new crimes ranging from violent plots to serious felonies. Others embraced a hardened identity, finding belonging in a community built around grievance and defiance. January 6th was no longer an event. It became a lifestyle. The message was unmistakable. Consequences were temporary, loyalty permanent. If you are wondering how norms collapse without a single dramatic moment, this is how. Not with one explosion, but with repetition, with exhaustion, with the steady lowering of outrage. And as institutions recalibrated, the impact began to move outward, away from courtrooms and headlines, and towards something more personal, toward you. And this is where it stops being abstract. Because while politicians debate narratives, you live with the consequences. You live in a country where the meaning of justice feels unstable, where accountability seems selective, where the rules appear to change depending on who holds power. You watch officers who defended the Capitol struggle for recognition, while those who attacked it are celebrated, compensated, or absolved. You see facts challenged, footage dismissed, and violence reframed as misunderstanding. And slowly, trust erodes not in one institution, but in the entire system. For many Americans, January 6th was not just a news event. It was a rupture in faith. Faith that elections matter, that laws apply evenly, that truth once documented cannot simply be waved away. If this makes you feel unsettled, that's not weakness, that's awareness. Because democracies don't collapse when people disagree. They collapse when people stop believing that disagreement still operates within shared rules. If you've ever felt that quiet unease, share this. Talk about it. Stay engaged. Because what happens next does not only depend on leaders. It depends on whether citizens still care enough to notice. And now, we need to widen the lens beyond America to see how this moment reverberates across the world. What happens in Washington never stays in Washington. Around the world, January 6th became a case study not just of democratic fragility, but of democratic precedent. Allies watched closely, adversaries watched even more closely. They did not focus only on the riot, they focused on the aftermath. They saw a democracy investigate itself in real time. They saw prosecutions move forward, and then they saw those consequences reversed by power. The lesson was not subtle. For authoritarian leaders, this became rhetorical ammunition. If the United States could pardon political violence, dismiss its own investigations, and rewrite its own history, who was it to lecture anyone else about rule of law? For fragile democracies, the signal was more troubling. If norms can be bent at the center of the system, they can snap at the edges. Electoral losers everywhere took note. So did movements built on grievance and identity. This is how democratic backsliding globalizes. Not through invasion, but imitation. Not through ideology, but permission. And once that permission is granted, the future no longer unfolds in a straight line. It branches, which brings us to the most important question of all. What happens next? When societies reach moments like this, the future rarely moves in a single direction. It fractures into possibilities. The first path is the most hopeful. Institutions, bruised but not broken, slowly reassert themselves. Facts regain standing. Accountability, even if delayed, returns through courts, elections, and public pressure. January 6th is neither erased nor weaponized, but integrated, taught, understood, and remembered as a warning. Democracy survives not because it is perfect, but because it learns. The second path is more familiar, a kind of uneasy normalization. The events of January 6th remain disputed, but no longer urgent. Pardons stand. Narratives coexist without resolution. Politics becomes transactional, memory selective. The system functions, but thinner. Trust never fully recovers. Democracy persists, but in a diminished form, less resilient, more cynical. The third path is the darkest. Political violence is fully legitimized after the fact. Accountability becomes conditional on power. History is openly rewritten. Each election loss is framed as theft. Each legal check as persecution. In that world, January 6th is no longer an aberration. It is a template. Which path emerges will not be decided by a single leader or a single ruling. It will be decided by repetition, by what is rewarded, what is ignored, and what citizens accept as normal. And that brings us to the final question. What, if anything, can still pull a divided democracy back from the edge? 5 years after January 6th, the most dangerous outcome is not that people remember it differently. It is that they stop arguing over it at all. Democracy does not require unanimity. It requires friction. It requires a shared commitment to evidence, even when that evidence is uncomfortable. When a society loses that, power fills the vacuum. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and history is rarely kind to nations that confuse loyalty with truth. What happened on January 6th was documented, investigated, and adjudicated. Those records exist. They do not disappear because they are inconvenient. The question before America is not whether the past can be rewritten. It's whether the future will be built on denial or reckoning. If this analysis helped you see the bigger picture, don't let it end here. Share it, discuss it, challenge it. The next chapter of this story is being written now in courtrooms, classrooms, and conversations like this one. Because democracies don't fail all at once. They fail when people decide that remembering no longer matters.